The woman who called herself Margaret Sullivan stepped off the dusty stagecoach in Spokane, Washington, with mud-caked boots and a small leather valise that contained everything she owned in the world, though the driver knew her ticket had been purchased under a different name entirely. It was late spring in 1882, and the town sprawled before her like a promise she wasn't sure she deserved to keep. All weathered wooden storefronts and dirt streets still damp from the morning rain that had swept down from the mountains. She had been someone else when she left Kansas City 3 weeks ago, and someone different still when she crossed into Oregon territory, shedding identities like a snake sheds skin, each name a layer of protection against the past that chased her west. The other passengers barely glanced her way as they collected their belongings, too focused on their own destinations to notice the way her hands trembled when she touched solid ground again. Margaret, or whatever her real name might be, took a steadying breath and looked down the main street of Spokane, trying to orient herself in this new world she'd chosen. The town was bigger than she'd expected, growing fast with the railroad pushing through and bringing commerce and people who asked fewer questions than they might have 10 years earlier. That suited her fine. A tall man stood outside the general store across the street, one boot propped against a hitching post, his hat pulled low against the afternoon sun that had finally burned through the clouds. He was watching her, she realized with a jolt, not with the leering interest she'd learned to deflect in roadhouses and train stations, but with a calm, assessing gaze that made her feel suddenly visible in a way she'd been trying to avoid. He was lean and broad-shouldered, maybe 25 or 26, with the weathered look of someone who spent his days working under an open sky. She turned away deliberately, fixing her attention on the hotel sign down the street. The Spokane house promised clean rooms and respectable lodging, and she had just enough money tucked into her boot to afford a week's stay while she figured out her next move. She'd planned this far and no further, driven west by necessity and fear in equal measure, and now that she'd arrived at what felt like the edge of the world, she had to build something from nothing. The hotel clerk was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and gray-streaked hair pulled into a practical bun. She looked up from her ledger when Margaret approached the desk, assessing her with the same careful attention the cowboy had shown, though with less intensity. "I need a room," Margaret said, keeping her voice steady, "just for a week to start." "That'll be $6, the clerk said, "paid in advance. Breakfast included if you're down by 7. Margaret counted out the coins, watching her emergency fund dwindle with each one that clinked onto the wooden counter. The clerk pushed a registration book toward her, pen resting beside it. "Name?" For a heartbeat, Margaret hesitated. She'd been Victoria Harrison in Kansas City, where she'd worked as a seamstress in a shop on the good side of town, until the owner's son had decided she owed him more than fine stitching and polite conversation. She'd become Elizabeth Marsh somewhere in Missouri, when she'd realized that Victoria's disappearance had been noticed, and questions were being asked. Now, standing in this hotel in Spokane with the mountains visible through the window and the smell of pine and river water in the air, she had to decide who she would be next. "Margaret Sullivan," she said finally, writing it in careful script. The clerk didn't blink, didn't question, just handed her a key with a wooden tag marked with the number 7. Her room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the street. Margaret set her valise on the bed and sank down beside it, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the miles she'd traveled. She was tired of running, tired of lying, tired of looking over her shoulder for the danger she'd left behind. But more than that, she was tired of not knowing who she really was anymore, beneath all the false names and manufactured histories. She allowed herself 5 minutes of stillness, then stood and unpacked her few belongings. 2 dresses, one for day and one for evening, both modest and carefully mended. A spare set of undergarments, a small sewing kit. A book of poetry that had belonged to her mother, the only thing she'd kept from her real life, the one that had ended when she was 17, and her parents died in a fire that took half their street in Philadelphia. That had been 5 years ago, and she'd been Florence Brennan then, a girl with a future and a family and a place in the world. She hadn't used her real name since. Margaret washed her face and changed into her better dress, then ventured back downstairs. The hotel dining room was empty except for an old man nursing a cup of coffee, and the clerk was gone from her post. Margaret stepped out onto the street, needing air and movement, needing to understand this town that would be her home if she could make it so. Spokane was rough around the edges but humming with energy, the kind of place where fortunes could be made or lost in a season. She passed a saloon, a barber shop, a land office with maps posted in the window showing parcels for sale. A Chinese laundry occupied a narrow building next to a lawyer's office, and she heard German being spoken from inside a bakery that made her mouth water with the smell of fresh bread. The general store where the Cowboy had been standing was busy with afternoon trade, and Margaret slipped inside, drawn by the thought that she might find work here. She needed employment, needed it desperately, and retail clerks didn't require references or explanations the way other positions might. The interior was dim after the bright street, packed with goods from floor to ceiling. Barrels of flour and sugar, bolts of fabric, tools and tack, jars of preserves and penny candy. A woman was buying thread, and a man was examining a new saddle with the serious attention of someone making a significant investment. "Help you find something." The voice came from behind her, and Margaret turned to find the Cowboy from earlier standing close enough that she could see his eyes were gray-blue, the color of distant mountains. Up close, he was younger than she'd first thought, maybe 24, with a straight nose and a mouth that looked like it smiled more often than it frowned. "I was hoping to speak with the owner," she said, lifting her chin. "About employment." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of interest or surprise. "That'd be my father. He's in the back doing inventory, but I can help you. I'm Colt Vaughn. I run the store with him." Margaret Sullivan. The name still felt foreign on her tongue, but she was committed now. "I have experience with retail. I'm good with customers, and I know fabric and sewing notions particularly well." Colt studied her for a long moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see through her careful composure to the desperation underneath. But when he spoke, his tone was professional, almost friendly. "We could use someone to help with the store. Business has been good lately, and my father's not as young as he used to be. When can you start?" "Tomorrow if you need me. Tomorrow works." He named a wage that was fair but not generous, and Margaret accepted it immediately, relief washing through her so strongly she almost swayed. 7 in the morning to 6 in the evening, 6 days a week. Sundays off. There's a room in the back if you ever need to rest, and we provide lunch. "Thank you." The words came out more heartfelt than she'd intended, and she saw his expression soften slightly. "Don't thank me until you've dealt with Mrs. Henderson trying to return fabric she's already cut," he said, and there was warmth in his voice that made something in her chest tighten. "She comes in every Wednesday like clockwork." Margaret smiled despite herself, the first real smile she'd managed in weeks. "I'll consider myself warned." She left the store feeling lighter than she had since Kansas City, with something that almost felt like hope building in her chest. She had a place to stay, a job starting tomorrow, and a town that seemed too busy growing to worry much about where its newest residents had come from. Maybe here, finally, she could stop running. That evening, she ate dinner in the hotel dining room, a simple meal of beef stew and bread that tasted better than anything she'd had in weeks. The clerk, whose name she learned was Mrs. Davies, sat with her for a few minutes, offering information about the town with the casual kindness of someone who remembered what it was like to be new and alone. "Spokane's a good place," Mrs. Davies said, refilling Margaret's coffee cup. "Rough still, but settling down. The railroad's bringing in more respectable folks, and the mining up north brings money through. You'll do well here if you work hard and keep your head down." "That's my plan," Margaret said, meaning it. She slept better that night than she had in months, lulled by the unfamiliar sounds of a town that wasn't trying to find her, that didn't know her real name or her history, or the reasons she'd left everything behind. When she woke before dawn, she dressed carefully in her day dress and pinned her dark hair into a neat bun, studying her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. She was 22 years old with brown eyes and a face that was pretty enough but not remarkable, the kind of face that could disappear into a crowd or a new town without drawing too much attention, perfect for someone who needed to disappear. The store was already open when she arrived, lamplight glowing warm in the early morning dimness. Colt was behind the counter, writing something in a ledger, and he looked up when she entered, his expression shifting into something that might have been pleasure. "Morning, Miss Sullivan." "Right on time. I don't believe in being late." He showed her around the store, explaining where everything was kept and how they organized their inventory. His father, Samuel Vaughn, emerged from the back room midway through the tour, a grizzled man in his 50s with Colt's eyes and a handshake that was firm but not aggressive. "Colt says you know retail," Samuel said, studying her with the same assessing gaze his son had used yesterday. "That true?" "I worked in a dress shop in Kansas City for 2 years," Margaret said, which was mostly accurate if you didn't count the fact that she'd been Victoria Harrison then, and had left in the middle of the night with her last wages in her pocket and fear driving her feet. Samuel nodded slowly. "Good enough. We treat our employees fair here and we expect fair work in return. You have any problems, you come to me or Colt. We don't tolerate rudeness from customers and we don't tolerate theft. Everything else we can work out. Understood?" The morning started slow, giving Margaret time to familiarize herself with the store's layout and pricing. Colt worked alongside her, restocking shelves and helping customers, and she found herself hyper-aware of his presence. The way he moved with easy confidence through the space, the way his voice carried when he laughed at something a customer said. He was patient when she asked questions, explaining the peculiarities of their regular customers and the unwritten rules that govern trade in a town like Spokane. "Mrs. Henderson will try to bargain on everything," he said, pointing to a stern-looking woman examining bolts of calico. "Hold firm on the price, but throw in an extra button or two and she'll feel like she won." "And him?" Margaret nodded toward a rough-looking man in mining clothes. "That's Jack Cooper. He's harmless, but he'll talk your ear off if you let him. Best to keep moving while you listen." By midday, Margaret had served a dozen customers and was beginning to feel the rhythm of the work, the comfortable routine of measuring and cutting and wrapping purchases in brown paper. It was similar enough to her time in Kansas City that her hands remembered the motions, but different enough that she didn't feel haunted by that other life, that other name. Colt brought her lunch from the bakery next door, fresh bread and cheese and apples, and they ate together in the small back room while Samuel minded the store. "So what brought you to Spokane?" Colt asked, his tone casual but his eyes watchful. Margaret had prepared for this question, had practiced the answer until it sounded natural. I wanted a fresh start. Kansas City was getting crowded, and I heard there were opportunities out west. No family back there, not anymore. That, at least, was true. Something in her voice must have warned him off pressing further, because he just nodded and took another bite of his apple. Well, Spokane's a good place for fresh starts. Half the people here are running from something or toward something. The town doesn't much care which, as long as you pull your weight. The afternoon brought more customers, and Margaret was kept busy enough that she didn't have time to think about the past or worry about the future. She helped a young mother choose fabric for a dress, measured out nails for a carpenter, and wrapped a birthday gift for a little girl with such care that her father tipped his hat and thanked her 3 times. When 6 o'clock came and Samuel locked the front door, Margaret realized she'd made it through her first day without disaster, without being recognized, without her carefully constructed story falling apart. "You did good work today," Colt said as she prepared to leave. "Real good. I think you'll fit in fine here." "Thank you." She meant it more than he could possibly know. The days settled into a pattern after that. Margaret worked 6 days a week at the store, learning the business and the rhythms of the town. She was good with customers, patient and knowledgeable, and within a week Samuel was telling people she'd been working there for years. She took satisfaction in the work, in being useful and competent, in earning her own way honestly. And she was aware, always, of Colt Vaughn. He was easy to work with, quick with a joke but serious when the situation called for it, and he treated her with a respect that felt genuine rather than perfunctory. He didn't pry into her past, didn't push for information she wasn't willing to give, but she caught him watching her sometimes with an expression she couldn't quite read, something curious and careful at once. She told herself it didn't matter, that she wasn't here to form attachments or let anyone get close enough to see behind the name she'd borrowed. But as the weeks passed and spring shifted toward summer, she found herself looking forward to their lunch breaks, to the conversations they shared while restocking shelves or walking to the bank to make deposits. He talked about growing up in Spokane, about watching the town transform from a rough frontier outpost to something more settled and civilized. His mother had died when he was 16, and he and his father had run the store together ever since, building it into one of the most successful businesses in town. "You ever think about leaving?" Margaret asked him one afternoon while they were inventorying the fabric section. Seeing what else is out there, Colt considered the question, his hand stilling on the bolt of blue cotton he was measuring. "I used to. When I was younger, I thought about going to California, maybe San Francisco. But this is home, you know, the store, the town, the people. It means something to be part of building something that lasts." Margaret felt a pang of something that might have been envy. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt that kind of rootedness, that sense of belonging to a place and a community. She'd been drifting for so long, changing names and towns like other people changed clothes, that the idea of staying anywhere permanently felt both appealing and terrifying. "That must be nice," she said quietly, "knowing where you belong." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she had to force herself not to turn away from the intensity of his gaze. "You could belong here too if you wanted. Spokane's good at taking people in, letting them become part of the fabric." She wanted to believe him, wanted it so badly her chest ached. But she'd been running too long to trust in permanence, in the idea that she could just stop and put down roots without consequences. 2 months after her arrival in Spokane, Margaret moved out of the hotel and into a small boarding house on the east side of town. Mrs. Davies had recommended it, and the landlady, a widow named Mrs. Chen, charged reasonable rent, and asked no questions about where Margaret had come from or why she'd arrived alone. The room was tiny, but it was hers, the first space she'd had to herself since leaving Philadelphia, and she took an almost fierce pride in making it comfortable with the small luxuries she could afford on her wages. Colt helped her move her belongings, carrying her valise and the few additional items she'd acquired with an easy strength that made her pulse quicken. He lingered after setting down her things, looking around the sparse room with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. "It's not much," Margaret said, suddenly self-conscious about the bare walls and simple furnishings. "It's honest," Colt replied, and she understood that he meant it as a compliment. "You've earned this." After he left, Margaret sat on the edge of her narrow bed and let herself feel, just for a moment, the weight of what she was building here. A job, a home, a life that was starting to feel real instead of temporary. And underneath it all, growing stronger every day despite her best efforts to suppress it, an attraction to Colt Vaughn that was becoming harder and harder to ignore. She knew it was dangerous, knew that letting anyone get close meant risking discovery, meant potentially having to run again. But Colt made her want to stay, made her want to believe that maybe, finally, she could stop being afraid. Summer came on hot and dry, and business at the store stayed brisk. Margaret had been in Spokane for 3 months, and the town was starting to feel familiar, the faces of regular customers becoming as recognizable as old friends. She'd made a few cautious friendships, mostly other women who worked in town, and Mrs. Chen proved to be a gentle, unobtrusive presence who sometimes left small gifts of food outside Margaret's door. It was on a sweltering afternoon in late July when everything changed. Margaret was helping a customer choose ribbon when the door opened, and a man walked in who made her blood run cold. He was well dressed in a city suit, maybe 40, with dark hair and cold eyes that swept the store with practiced efficiency. He wasn't from Spokane, that much was obvious, and something about the way he moved, purposeful and predatory, made Margaret's instincts scream danger. She forced herself to stay calm, to finish with her customer and move toward the back of the store where Colt was working on the accounts. But the man's gaze followed her, tracking her movement with an attention that felt intentional. "Can I help you find something?" Samuel called from behind the counter, his tone friendly but with an edge that suggested he'd picked up on the same wrongness Margaret had felt. "Just looking," the man said, his voice smooth and cultured, wrong for this rough town. "I'm new to Spokane, trying to get the lay of the land." Margaret ducked into the back room, her heart hammering. She didn't know why this man frightened her so much, only that every instinct she'd honed over 2 years of running was screaming at her to hide, to flee, to become invisible. Colt looked up from his ledger, concern crossing his face immediately. "What's wrong?" the man who just came in, Margaret whispered, hating how her voice shook. "Something about him feels wrong." Colt rose immediately, moving to the doorway to peer out at the stranger. The man was examining tools now, handling a hammer with the care of someone who'd never done a day's manual labor in his life. After a moment, he set it down and walked out without buying anything, the door swinging shut behind him. "He's gone," Colt said, but he was watching Margaret with a new intensity, a question forming in his eyes that she desperately didn't want to answer. "I'm sorry," she said, trying to steady herself. "I don't know what came over me, he just seemed off." "Margaret." Colt's voice was gentle but firm. "You've been here 3 months and you've never once talked about where you came from or why. I've respected that because I figure everyone's got a right to their privacy. But if you're in some kind of trouble, if someone's looking for you, I need to know, so I can help." She wanted to lie, to brush off his concern and maintain the careful distance she'd worked so hard to preserve. But looking at him, At the genuine worry in his eyes and the way he'd moved to protect her without hesitation, she found she couldn't do it anymore. "Can we talk somewhere private?" she asked. "After the store closes, my place," Colt said immediately. "Come to dinner. We'll talk." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of anxiety and dread. The stranger didn't return, but Margaret found herself watching the door constantly, jumping at every customer who entered. By the time Samuel locked up for the evening, her nerves were stretched taut enough to snap. Colt lived in a small house behind the store, a simple two-room structure that he'd built with his own hands after his mother died. It was neat and spare, furnished with handmade furniture and a few personal touches that spoke to his character. A shelf of books, mostly practical guides and a few novels. A photograph of a woman who must have been his mother. A well-maintained rifle over the door. He cooked dinner while Margaret sat at his small table, trying to find the words for a story she'd never told anyone, not in its entirety. He didn't push, just moved around the kitchen with easy competence, frying potatoes and beef and making coffee strong enough to strip paint. They ate in relative silence, and then Colt cleared the plates and sat across from her, his full attention focused on her face. "Tell me," he said simply. So she did. "My real name is Florence Brennan," she started, and the name felt strange on her tongue, like a piece of clothing that no longer fit. "I'm from Philadelphia. My parents died in a fire when I was 17, and I had nothing, no family, no money, no prospects. So I moved to Kansas City and found work as a seamstress under the name Victoria Harrison, because I thought a fresh start meant a new name." She told him about the dress shop, about the owner's son who had decided she belonged to him, who had cornered her in the back room late one evening and made his intentions clear. She told him how she'd fought him off and fled that night, knowing that his father would believe his story over hers, that she'd be the one blamed and punished. "I became Elizabeth Marsh in Missouri," she continued, her voice flat with remembered fear. "I worked in a boarding house until the owner started asking too many questions about my papers and my past, so I kept moving west, changing names, trying to stay ahead of anyone who might be looking." "And now you're Margaret Sullivan," Colt said quietly. "Now I'm Margaret Sullivan," she agreed. "Or I was, until today. That man in the store, I don't know who he was, but he looked at me like he was searching for someone, and I've learned to trust that feeling." Colt was silent for a long moment, processing everything she'd told him. Margaret braced herself for judgment, for disgust, for him to tell her she needed to leave his store and his town and his life. Instead, he reached across the table and took her hand, his grip warm and solid and anchoring. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "That took courage." "You don't think I'm awful, for lying, for using false names. I think you survived," Colt said firmly. "I think you did what you had to do to stay safe, and there's no shame in that. But Florence," he said her real name carefully, testing it out, "I don't need the real one. I don't care if you're Margaret or Elizabeth or Victoria or whoever else you've been. The woman I know, the woman I've worked with these past 3 months, she's real to me. Her name doesn't change that." Something in Margaret's chest cracked open at his words, a wall she'd built around herself crumbling under the weight of his acceptance. Tears pricked her eyes and she blinked them back fiercely. "I like Margaret," she said, her voice rough. "I chose it for myself, not because I was running, but because I wanted it. Can I keep it? Can I just be Margaret and let the rest go?" "You can be whoever you want to be," Colt said, and she believed him. "And if anyone comes looking for someone else, someone you used to be, they won't find her. Because Margaret Sullivan works at my store and lives in Spokane, and she's exactly who she says she is." They sat there in his small kitchen, hands clasped across the table, and Margaret felt something shift fundamentally inside her. She'd told someone the truth, or close enough to it, and the world hadn't ended. Colt hadn't turned her away. If anything, the way he was looking at her now held even more warmth than before, a tenderness that made her breath catch. "The man in the store today," Colt said after a while. "Do you think he was actually looking for you, or was it just instinct?" "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "Maybe neither. Maybe I'm just so used to running that I see threats everywhere." "Well, either way, you're not alone now. If someone does come looking, they'll have to go through me first. And my father, and half the town that's come to like you just fine. Spokane takes care of its own." The casual way he included her in that own made Margaret's heart skip. She'd been alone for so long, responsible for only herself, that the idea of having someone in her corner felt almost foreign. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked, needing to understand. Colt smiled, a little crooked, a little shy. "Because I care about you, Margaret. I have for a while now, if I'm being honest. I know the timing's not great, what with everything you just told me, but I figured you should know where I stand." Margaret's pulse quickened. She'd been trying so hard not to acknowledge the attraction between them, the way her heart lifted whenever he walked into a room, the way she found excuses to work near him just to hear his voice. But hearing him say it out loud, plainly and without artifice, made it impossible to deny any more. "I care about you too," she said quietly. "I've been trying not to because I didn't think I deserved to want anything for myself, but I do. Care about you, I mean." "Then that's enough for now," Colt said. "We'll take it slow, figure the rest out as we go, but Margaret, you deserve good things. You deserve to be happy and safe and settled. Don't ever let anyone, including yourself, tell you otherwise." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and they sat together in the golden evening light filtering through his window until the shadows grew long, and it was time for her to return to her boarding house. Colt walked her home through streets that were cooling with the onset of night, and at her door he squeezed her hand once more before letting go. "See you tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," Margaret agreed, and she went inside feeling lighter than she had in years. The mysterious stranger didn't return to the store, and as the days passed, Margaret began to relax again, to believe that maybe it had just been her paranoia, her survival instincts working overtime. She fell back into the comfortable rhythm of work, and her relationship with Colt deepened in small, steady increments. He started walking her home every evening, and they'd linger outside her boarding house talking about everything and nothing. He told her stories about his childhood, about learning the store business from his father, about his dreams for the future. She shared what she could of her own history, carefully edited but more honest than she'd been with anyone in years. They had their first official meal together on a Sunday afternoon in August. A picnic by the Spokane River with food from the bakery, and the whole day stretching before them unscheduled and unhurried. Margaret wore her best dress, and Colt had clearly made an effort too, his hair neatly combed and his shirt freshly laundered. They sat on a blanket under the shade of a cottonwood tree, watching the water flow past and listening to the birds singing in the branches overhead. It was peaceful in a way Margaret had almost forgotten existed, quiet without being lonely, easy without being boring. "Can I ask you something?" Colt said after they'd eaten, lying back on the blanket with his hands behind his head. "Of course. Do you ever regret it?" "Leaving Philadelphia, changing your name, all of it?" Margaret considered the question seriously, wanting to give him an honest answer. "I regret that it was necessary," she said finally. "I regret that I didn't have anyone to turn to, anyone who could have helped me stay. But do I regret coming west, ending up here? No. If I hadn't run, I would never have found Spokane. I would never have found you." Colt turned his head to look at her, his gray-blue eyes warm with affection. "I'm glad you found me too." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her cheek, and Margaret leaned into the touch without thinking. The space between them seemed to shrink, charged with possibility, and when Colt sat up and cupped her face in both hands, she didn't pull away. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question more than a statement. But when Margaret kissed him back, threading her fingers through his hair and pressing closer, it deepened into something more certain, more real. She felt the world narrow to just this moment, this man, this feeling of rightness that she'd been chasing without knowing it for so long. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing harder, Colt rested his forehead against hers and laughed softly. "I've been wanting to do that for months," he admitted. "So have I," Margaret said, and kissed him again. They spent the rest of the afternoon by the river, talking and kissing and simply being together. And by the time Colt walked her home that evening, Margaret felt like a different person than the frightened woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach 3 months ago. She was still Margaret Sullivan, still carrying secrets and a complicated past, but she was also someone who was choosing to stay, choosing to build something real, choosing to let herself be happy. August melted into September, and Margaret's life in Spokane settled into a comfortable pattern. She worked at the store 6 days a week, had dinner with Colt most evenings, and spent her Sundays exploring the town and the surrounding countryside with him. They went riding when they could borrow horses, and she learned to shoot under his patient instruction, the rifle becoming familiar in her hands even though she hoped she'd never need to use it for anything more serious than target practice. Samuel Vaughn made no secret of his approval of their relationship, and the town seemed to accept it without comment, folding them into the social fabric as naturally as if they'd been together for years. Margaret found herself invited to church socials and quilting bees, included in the informal networks of women who formed the backbone of community life. She was becoming, she realized with wonder, a person again instead of just a collection of false names and fabricated histories. It was in mid-September when Samuel pulled her aside one afternoon while Colt was out making deliveries. "I want to talk to you about something," he said, his tone serious but not unkind. "About you and Colt." Margaret's stomach clenched with anxiety. "If you're concerned about our working together, I can assure you it doesn't interfere with business." "That's not it," Samuel said, waving off her concern. "The boy's been happier these past few months than I've seen him since his mother died. You're good for him, good for both of us really. The store runs better with you here." "Then what is it?" Samuel studied her for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "Colt told me about your situation, about the names you've used, the reasons you came west. He thought I should know in case anyone came looking." Margaret felt her face heat with shame and fear. "I understand if you want me to leave." "Now, why would I want that?" Samuel asked, looking genuinely puzzled. "Girl, you think you're the only person in this town with a complicated past. Half the folks in Spokane came here running from something. The difference is that you've worked hard, been honest in your dealings, and made yourself part of the community. That counts for more than whatever name you're using." Relief flooded through her so strongly she had to grip the counter to steady herself. "Thank you." "Don't thank me, just keep being good to my son. He's planning to ask you to marry him, you know. Probably around Christmas if I know him. Boy's traditional that way." Margaret's heart stuttered in her chest. "He told you that, didn't have to." "I can see it in how he looks at you, how he talks about the future like it includes you automatically. So I'm asking, as his father, whether you're planning to stay. Because if you're going to run again, if there's some threat that's going to pull you away, I need to know now before he gets any more invested." It was a fair question, asked without judgment, and Margaret took her time answering it. She thought about the past 2 years, about the fear and exhaustion and loneliness of constantly moving, constantly hiding. And then she thought about Spokane, about the life she was building here, about Colt, and the way he made her feel safe and seen and valued. "I'm staying," she said firmly. "Whatever comes, whoever might be looking, I'm not running anymore. This is my home now. Colt is my future if he'll have me, and Margaret Sullivan is who I choose to be." Samuel nodded slowly, satisfaction evident on his weathered face. "Good. That's real good. Now get back to work before Mrs. Henderson shows up wanting to return that fabric she bought last week." The conversation stayed with Margaret all day, warming her from the inside out. The idea of marrying Colt, of making their relationship permanent and public, both thrilled and terrified her. She'd never dared to imagine a future that stable, that rooted. But now that Samuel had planted the seed, she couldn't stop thinking about it. That evening, as Colt walked her home under a sky full of stars, she found herself studying him in profile, imagining a life spent waking up beside him, building a business and a family and a future together. It felt possible in a way nothing had felt possible in years. "What are you thinking about?" Colt asked, catching her staring. "The future," Margaret said honestly. "About staying." "I'm glad," Colt said, pulling her closer as they walked, "because I can't imagine mine without you in it." They'd reached her boarding house, but instead of saying goodnight, Margaret rose on her toes and kissed him, pouring all her hope and affection into the gesture. Colt responded immediately, his arms coming around her waist and lifting her slightly off the ground. And for a perfect moment, the world was just the two of them and the promise of tomorrow. Fall came on fast in Spokane, the leaves turning gold and red and the air taking on a crisp edge that promised winter wasn't far behind. Business at the store stayed steady, and Margaret had saved enough money to buy herself a new dress and a warm coat for the coming cold months. She felt wealthy in a way that had nothing to do with money, rich in community and purpose and love. Colt had started talking more openly about the future, about expanding the store or maybe opening a second location in one of the mining towns to the north. He always included Margaret in these plans, using "we" instead of "I", and she let herself believe in the vision he was painting. It was late October when the stranger returned. Margaret saw him through the store window first, the same well-dressed man from July walking down the main street with the same purposeful stride. Her blood went cold and her hands stilled on the bolt of fabric she was measuring. "Colt," she said, her voice tight. He looked up immediately, saw her expression, and followed her gaze out the window. His face hardened when he spotted the stranger. "Go in the back," Colt said quietly. "I'll handle this." "No," Margaret surprised herself with the firmness in her voice. "I'm tired of hiding. If he's looking for me, let him find me. Let's end this." The stranger entered the store a moment later, and up close Margaret could see details she'd missed before. The expensive cut of his suit, the calculating intelligence in his eyes, the slight curl of distaste on his lips as he surveyed the rough frontier establishment. "Good afternoon," he said, his accent marking him as Eastern, educated. "I'm looking for information about a woman who may have passed through Spokane earlier this year. She would have been traveling alone, possibly under an assumed name." "Lots of women travel through Spokane," Colt said evenly, positioning himself slightly in front of Margaret. "What makes you think we'd know this particular one?" The stranger pulled a small photograph from his pocket and laid it on the counter. Margaret's stomach dropped when she saw it was a picture of herself, or rather a picture of Florence Brennan taken in Philadelphia when she was 16, a lifetime ago. "Her name is Florence Brennan," the stranger said, "though she's also used Victoria Harrison and Elizabeth Marsh." She's wanted for theft in Kansas City." "That's a lie," Margaret said, stepping forward despite Colt's protective stance. Her fear was burning away, replaced by anger at this man who'd hunted her across half the country. "I never stole anything. I left because my employer's son assaulted me, and I knew no one would believe me over him." The stranger's eyes gleamed with satisfaction at having found his quarry. "So you admit you're Florence Brennan?" "I admit that used to be my name. Now I'm Margaret Sullivan, and I'm a resident of Spokane, Washington. I work at this store, I pay my rent, and I've done nothing illegal. So whatever lies were told about me in Kansas City, they have no power here. The law says otherwise. There's a warrant for your arrest. Let me see it." Samuel had emerged from the back room, his expression granite hard. "You come into my store making accusations. You better have paperwork to back it up." The stranger hesitated just long enough to confirm what Margaret had suspected. "I don't have it with me, but I can assure you it exists." "Then I can assure you we don't have to cooperate with anything you say," Samuel replied. "This young lady has been a model citizen and a valued employee. Unless you have an actual warrant signed by an actual judge, you can get out of my store." "I'm a Pinkerton detective," the stranger said, as if that explained everything. "I've been hired by the Harrison family to retrieve their property and see that this woman faces justice. The Pinkerton agency has no jurisdiction in Washington territory," Colt said. His voice was calm, but Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand had drifted to rest on the knife at his belt. "And Miss Sullivan isn't anyone's property, so I suggest you leave before we call the town marshal." The detective's mouth tightened. "This isn't over. I'll return with proper documentation." "You do that," Samuel said. "And while you're at it, you might want to investigate what really happened in Kansas City, because I'm betting the Harrison boys' version and the truth are two very different things." The detective left, but the damage was done. Margaret felt exposed, vulnerable, all the safety she'd built over the past 6 months suddenly revealed as illusion. Her hands were shaking and she couldn't make them stop. "He knows," she whispered. "He knows I'm here. He'll come back." "Let him," Colt said fiercely, taking her hands in his. "We'll fight this, Margaret. We'll get a lawyer. We'll talk to the marshal. We'll do whatever it takes. But you are not going back to Kansas City, and you are not running again. This is your home, and we're going to protect it." Samuel was already locking the front door, flipping the sign to closed even though it was only mid-afternoon. "Colt's right. This is a legal matter now, and we need to handle it properly. I know a good lawyer in town, Owen McCready. He's handled territory disputes and mining claims, and he knows how to navigate the law. We'll go see him first thing tomorrow." "But what if the detective was telling the truth?" Margaret asked, her voice small. "What if there really is a warrant? What if I have to go back?" "Then we'll prove you're innocent," Colt said with absolute certainty. "Because you are, Margaret. You defended yourself against an assault and you ran to save your own life. That's not theft, that's survival. Any reasonable judge will see that." Margaret wanted to believe him, wanted to have his faith in the justice system and the goodness of people. But she'd learned the hard way that money and status could bend the law, that the word of a wealthy man's son would always carry more weight than that of a seamstress with no family and no connections. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I know," Colt said gently, "but you're not alone this time. Whatever happens, we face it together." That night, Margaret barely slept, tossing and turning in her narrow bed while scenarios spun through her mind. She could run again, disappear into another town with another name, but the thought made her physically ill. She was done running. Spokane was her home, Colt was her future, and she would fight for both with everything she had. The next morning, she and Colt went to see Owen McCready, a sharp-eyed man in his 40s who listened to her story with careful attention, and asked pointed questions about dates and names and specifics. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "First thing we need to determine is whether there's actually a warrant," Macready said. "Pinkerton detectives sometimes stretch the truth to intimidate people. If there is a warrant, we need to see what the charges are and whether they have any merit, and we need to establish your residency here, prove that you're a contributing member of this community." "How do we do that?" Margaret asked. "Character witnesses, letters of reference, evidence of your employment and good standing. The territorial courts have a lot of discretion in cases like these, and judges tend to be sympathetic to people who have established roots and are living honest lives." "So there's a chance?" Colt asked. "There's always a chance. But I won't lie to you, Miss Sullivan. If the Harrison family has money and influence, they can make things difficult. We need to be prepared for a fight." They spent the next hour going over details, with Macready taking careful notes and occasionally asking Margaret to clarify or elaborate on parts of her story. By the time they left his office, Margaret felt marginally better, if not exactly hopeful. At least they were taking action instead of just waiting for disaster to strike. Word spread quickly through Spokane about the Pinkerton detective and his accusations. To Margaret's surprise and overwhelming relief, the response from the town was almost universally supportive. Mrs. Davies from the hotel stopped by the store to offer her testimony about Margaret's character. The landlady, Mrs. Chen, did the same. Even Mrs. Henderson, the notorious fabric haggler, came in to say that she'd never met a more honest shopkeeper, and anyone who said otherwise was a damned liar. "You've made yourself part of this community," Samuel told Margaret as they closed up the store that evening. "And Spokane takes care of its own. Don't you forget that." The detective returned 3 days later with a document that he claimed was a warrant for Margaret's arrest, though Macready immediately identified it as a civil summons rather than a criminal warrant. The charges were for theft of wages and breach of contract, civil matters that would require Margaret to appear in a Kansas court, but didn't obligate the local marshal to arrest her. "You can ignore this," Macready advised. "It has no teeth in Washington territory. They'd have to extradite you, and the territorial governor isn't going to authorize extradition for a civil dispute." "So I'm safe?" Margaret asked, hardly daring to believe it. "For now. But Miss Sullivan, I strongly advise you to prepare a defense in case this escalates. Write down everything you remember about your time in Kansas City, especially the assault. Try to think of anyone who might have witnessed it or who could testify to the Harrison son's character. If this does go to court, we want to be ready." Margaret spent the next week doing exactly that, documenting her history in painful detail while Colt sat with her, offering quiet support and encouragement. It was harder than she'd expected, dredging up memories she'd tried so hard to bury. But it was also strangely cathartic to finally put it all into words. She wrote about growing up in Philadelphia, about losing her parents and finding herself alone at 17 with no skills and no prospects. She wrote about the kindness of the woman who'd hired her at the dress shop in Kansas City, about learning the trade and taking pride in her work. And she wrote about the night Thomas Harrison had cornered her, about the fear and the fight and the knowledge that reporting him would only make things worse for her. When she finished, she had 30 pages of testimony in her careful handwriting, and Macready read it with a grave expression before looking up at her with something like respect. "This is good," he said. "This is exactly what we need if it comes to a trial. You're credible, Miss Sullivan. Your story holds together and it rings true. Any judge worth his salt will see that." "But what if the judge isn't worth his salt?" Margaret asked. "What if money matters more than truth?" "Then we appeal," Macready said firmly, "and we keep appealing until we find someone who'll listen. But I don't think it'll come to that. The Harrison family is overreaching, and they know it. This is intimidation, an attempt to scare you into coming back and accepting their version of events. If you stand firm, they'll likely give up and move on." As November arrived and the first snow dusted the mountains around Spokane, the detective's presence became a familiar irritation rather than an immediate threat. He stayed in town, asking questions and trying to find dirt on Margaret, but everyone he spoke to gave him the same story. She was honest, hardworking, and well-liked. She'd done nothing wrong. Frustrated, the detective finally confronted Margaret directly one afternoon as she was leaving the store. "You can't hide forever," he said, stepping into her path. "The Harrisons want justice and they're willing to pay for it." "Justice for what?" Margaret asked, surprised by her own steadiness. "For their son assaulting me, for me daring to refuse him. You stole 3 weeks' wages when you left. I took the wages I'd earned." "That's not theft. That's collecting what I was owed. And even if it were theft, which it isn't, it doesn't justify what Thomas Harrison tried to do to me." The detective's expression shifted just slightly, and Margaret realized something. "You know," she said. "You've investigated the family, and you know I'm telling the truth. This isn't about justice at all. It's about pride, about a wealthy family not wanting to admit their son is a predator." "What I know doesn't matter," the detective said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm paid to do a job." "Then tell them the job is done," Margaret said. "Tell them I'm not coming back, that I've built a life here, and that if they pursue this any further, I'll go public with what their son did. I'll write to every newspaper between here and Kansas City. I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man Thomas Harrison is." It was a bluff, mostly, but the detective didn't need to know that. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll relay your message," he said, and walked away. Margaret watched him go, her heart pounding but her head held high. She'd stood up for herself, had refused to be intimidated or chased away, and it felt like a victory even if the war wasn't quite over yet. Colt had witnessed the exchange from the store window, and when Margaret came back inside, he swept her into his arms, holding her tight. "I'm so proud of you," he murmured into her hair. "You were magnificent." "I was terrified," Margaret admitted. "You were brave. There's a difference." The detective left Spokane 2 days later, boarding the eastbound stage without ceremony or farewell. Macready heard through his legal contacts that the Harrison family had decided to drop the matter, apparently persuaded by the cost and difficulty of pursuing someone across territorial lines for what amounted to a minor civil dispute. "You're free," Macready told Margaret when he delivered the news. "They can't touch you now. You can be Margaret Sullivan for the rest of your life if you want. No one looking over your shoulder, no one questioning your past." Margaret cried then, great heaving sobs of relief and release, and Colt held her through it while Samuel patted her shoulder awkwardly, and Macready discreetly excused himself. When she finally got herself under control, she felt lighter than she had in years, like she'd set down a burden she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten how heavy it was. "It's really over?" she asked, needing to hear it again. "It's really over," Colt confirmed. "You're safe, Margaret. You're home. Home." The word resonated through her like a bell, clear and true and right. Spokane was her home. The store, her boarding house room, the people she'd come to know and care about, this was where she belonged. "I love you," she said, the words spilling out before she could think about them. "I love you, Colt. I think I have for months, but I was too scared to say it." Colt's smile could have lit the whole territory. "I love you too. I've been waiting to say it until you felt safe enough to hear it. But Margaret, I love you so much it scares me sometimes. You're everything I didn't know I was looking for." They kissed there in the store in front of Samuel, who cleared his throat and muttered something about young people having no sense of propriety, but sounded more amused than disapproving. And Margaret felt, for the first time in 5 years, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Colt proposed on Christmas Eve, in the small house behind the store, with snow falling outside and a fire crackling in the hearth. He'd cooked dinner, an ambitious meal that was only slightly burned, and after they'd eaten he pulled a small box from his pocket and got down on one knee in the traditional way. "Margaret Sullivan," he said, his voice serious but his eyes warm. "I know you've had more than your share of hardship, and I know trust doesn't come easy for you. But I promise you, if you'll have me, I will spend every day of the rest of my life making sure you know you're loved and safe and valued. Will you marry me?" The ring was simple, a gold band with a small diamond, probably expensive by Spokane standards but modest compared to the jewelry worn by wealthy city women. To Margaret, it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, absolutely yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger and stood to kiss her. And it felt like a promise, like a beginning, like everything she'd been running toward without knowing it. They married in February of 1883, in a simple ceremony at the church with most of Spokane in attendance. Margaret wore a new dress she'd sewn herself, pale blue with lace at the collar, and Colt wore his best suit with a fresh haircut and a nervous expression that made her love him even more. Samuel stood as Colt's best man, and Mrs. Davies served as Margaret's witness, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the whole congregation cheered. The reception was held at the hotel, with food and music and dancing that went late into the night. Margaret danced with Colt, with Samuel, with Owen McCready and half the men in town, and she felt joy radiating from her core, bright and warm and real. This was her life now, her community, her future, and she was no longer afraid of it. Colt had expanded the house in preparation for married life, adding a second bedroom and a proper kitchen, and when he carried her over the threshold that night, Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at the rightness of it all. "Welcome home, Mrs. Vaughn," Colt said, setting her down gently. "Mrs. Vaughn," Margaret repeated, testing out the name. It fit better than any of the others she'd worn, more real than Florence Brennan or Victoria Harrison or Elizabeth Marsh or even Margaret Sullivan. She was Margaret Vaughn now, and that identity felt earned rather than borrowed. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, and afterward, lying in the darkness with Colt's arms around her, Margaret felt a peace she'd never experienced before. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, with exactly who she was supposed to be with, and the past could finally stay in the past where it belonged. They settled into married life with easy comfort, working together at the store during the day and coming home together in the evenings. Samuel had begun to step back from daily operations, trusting Colt and Margaret to run things while he spent more time on the civic projects and community organizing that interested him. The store thrived under their management, and within 6 months they were able to hire additional help, a young man named Peter who was eager to learn the business. Margaret found she had a talent for the commercial side of retail, for understanding what customers wanted and how to price things competitively while still maintaining healthy margins. Colt handled the physical work and customer relations, and together they made a formidable team. By their first anniversary, the store was the most successful business in Spokane, and they were beginning to talk seriously about expansion. But more importantly, they were happy. They fought sometimes, usually about small things like how to organize the stock room or whether they could afford to extend credit to a struggling customer. But they always talked it through and reached compromises that left them both satisfied. Colt was patient with Margaret's occasional moments of fear, when old instincts would surface, and she'd look at him with sudden panic, worried that this happiness was too good to be real. He'd simply hold her and remind her that she was safe, that he loved her, that she could trust this life they were building. In the spring of 1884, Margaret realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but she waited to tell Colt until she was certain, wanting to give him the news when she could also give him certainty. She chose a Sunday afternoon when they were alone in the house, sitting together on the porch and watching the mountains turn gold in the setting sun. "I have something to tell you," she said, taking his hand. Colt looked at her, concern flickering across his face. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's wonderful. Colt, we're going to have a baby." The expression that crossed his face was pure joy, unguarded and overwhelming. He pulled her into his arms, laughing and kissing her and babbling questions about when and how she was feeling and whether she'd seen the doctor yet. His excitement was infectious, and Margaret found herself laughing too, her own joy multiplying in the reflection of his. "We're having a baby," Colt repeated as if testing the words. "We're going to be parents." "Are you happy?" Margaret asked, though his reaction had made the answer obvious. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," Colt said. "Margaret, you've given me everything I didn't know I needed. A partner, a love, and now a family. I'm the luckiest man in Washington Territory." They told Samuel that evening, and his reaction was almost as enthusiastic as Colt's had been. He immediately began making plans for how they'd need to adjust the house, where they'd put a nursery, what furniture they'd need to build or buy. It was overwhelming and wonderful, and Margaret felt embraced by their planning, included in every decision. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Margaret found the heat of summer difficult and the constant tiredness frustrating when she wanted to keep working at the store. Colt and Samuel insisted she rest more, cutting her hours and insisting she take frequent breaks, and eventually she agreed to step back from daily operations and focus on preparing for the baby. She used the time to sew tiny clothes and blankets, to read everything she could find about infant care, and to spend time with other mothers in town who shared their experiences and advice. She'd been alone for so long that the sense of community still sometimes took her by surprise. The way women rallied around each other, sharing knowledge and support and practical help. Their son was born in December of 1884, a few weeks before Christmas, after a labor that lasted through the night and into the following afternoon. Margaret had never experienced pain like that, had never understood how childbirth could be both the hardest and most worthwhile thing a person could do. But when the midwife placed the baby in her arms, red-faced and squalling and perfect, she understood completely. "He's beautiful," Colt whispered, his voice choked with emotion as he looked down at his son. "He's absolutely perfect." They named him James Samuel Vaughn after Colt's father, and the baby quickly became the center of their world. Margaret had worried during the pregnancy that she wouldn't know how to be a mother, that her own motherless years would have left her unprepared, but she found that love and instinct carried her through. James was a good baby, healthy and curious and blessed with his father's easy temperament. Colt was a devoted father, changing diapers and walking the floor with James when he was fussy and singing terrible off-key lullabies that somehow always worked. Samuel was equally smitten, spending hours with his grandson and spoiling him shamelessly with toys and treats. The store continued to thrive even with Margaret's reduced involvement, and by the time James was 6 months old, she was ready to return to work part-time, bringing the baby with her and setting up a cradle in the back room where he could sleep while she helped customers. The arrangement worked well, and the townspeople loved having a baby around, often stopping by just to coo at James and offer unsolicited parenting advice. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm of work and family, of building a business and raising a child, of small daily joys and occasional challenges that they faced together. Margaret sometimes thought about the girl she'd been in Philadelphia, about Florence Brennan who'd lost everything and started running. That girl felt like a stranger now, someone from another life entirely. She was Margaret Vaughn, wife and mother and successful businesswoman, and she was content in a way she'd never imagined possible. Their second child, a daughter they named Catherine Rose, arrived in the summer of 1886. The labor was easier than James's had been, and Catherine came into the world with a fierce cry and a determined expression that made Colt laugh. "She's going to be a handful," he predicted, and he was right. Catherine was more demanding than James had been, fussier and more particular, but she was also affectionate and quick to smile, and she had Colt wrapped around her tiny finger from day one. James, now 18 months old, was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything and constantly bringing her toys and blankets she didn't need. The house felt full in the best way, loud with children's voices and cluttered with the detritus of family life. Margaret sometimes stood in the doorway watching her family, Colt playing with the children on the floor, and she'd feel such overwhelming gratitude it almost hurt. In the fall of 1887, Samuel Vaughn died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 62. It was sudden and unexpected, though the doctor said his heart had simply given out, worn down by years of hard work and frontier living. The loss hit Colt hard, and Margaret held him through his grief, returning the comfort he'd given her so many times before. They buried Samuel in the Spokane cemetery on a hillside overlooking the town he'd helped build, and it seemed like half of Washington territory came to pay their respects. Samuel had been well loved, a pillar of the community, and his absence left a hole that would take time to fill. But life continued, as it always does. Colt inherited his father's share of the store, making him and Margaret full owners, and they honored Samuel's memory by continuing to run it with the integrity and fair dealing he'd always insisted upon. James started asking questions about his grandfather, too young to fully understand death, but aware that someone important was missing. And Margaret told him stories about Samuel, keeping his memory alive for the children who would never really know him. In 1889, Washington became a state rather than a territory, and Spokane celebrated with parades and speeches, and a sense of pride in having grown from a frontier outpost to a proper American city. The store did record business that week, and Margaret and Colt stood together watching the festivities, their children on their shoulders, and marveled at how much had changed in the 7 years since Margaret had stepped off that stagecoach. "You ever think about the past?" Colt asked her that night after the children were asleep. "About the names you used to use, the life you left behind." "Sometimes," Margaret admitted, "but it feels distant now, like a story that happened to someone else. I'm not that person anymore. I haven't been for a long time." "Do you have any regrets?" Margaret considered the question seriously. "I regret the circumstances that forced me to run. I regret that I had to be afraid for so long, but I don't regret anything that brought me here to you, to our family. Every choice I made, even the scared and desperate ones, led me to this life. How could I regret that?" Colt pulled her close, kissing her temple. "I love you, Margaret Vaughn. I love the woman you are, the mother you've become, the partner you've been. And I'm grateful every single day that you chose to stop running when you reached Spokane." "I'm grateful too," Margaret said, "for all of it, for you believing in me when I used a name that wasn't mine, for you saying you didn't need the real one, that who I was in that moment was enough." They stood together in the darkness of their bedroom, holding each other and listening to the sounds of their children breathing in the next room. And Margaret felt the kind of bone-deep contentment that comes from being exactly where you're supposed to be. The years continued to pass, marked by the rhythms of family and business. James grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved helping at the store and had his father's easy way with people. Catherine was more serious, more studious, showing an early aptitude for numbers that delighted Margaret. In 1891, they welcomed another son, Henry Charles, who had Margaret's dark hair and Colt's gray-blue eyes. The store expanded, first to a second location in a nearby mining town, then to a mail-order business that served customers throughout the region. Margaret's talent for business had fully flourished, and she became known throughout Washington state as a shrewd but fair entrepreneur. Colt handled the daily operations and customer relations, while Margaret managed the finances and long-term planning, and together they built something that would last beyond their own lifetimes. They weathered economic downturns and harsh winters, illness and injury and the normal challenges of raising children and running a business. But through it all, they had each other, and they had the foundation of love and trust they'd built in those early days when Margaret was still learning to believe she deserved happiness. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1893, Colt gave Margaret a gift that made her cry. It was a leather-bound journal with her name embossed on the cover in gold letters, Margaret Brennan Vaughn. "Your real name and your chosen name together," Colt explained. "Because all of you, every part of your history is worth honoring. You don't have to hide anymore, Margaret. You never have to hide again." She ran her fingers over the embossed letters, feeling the weight of a past she'd tried so hard to escape and a present she'd fought to build. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me, all of me." That night, she began writing in the journal, documenting her story from Philadelphia to Kansas City to Spokane. She wrote about fear and courage, about running and stopping, about finding love in a place where no one cared what name she used or where she'd come from. She wrote it all down so her children would someday understand, so they'd know their mother had been more than just Margaret Vaughn, that she'd survived and struggled and ultimately triumphed. In 1895, as their eldest son James approached his 11th birthday, he asked Margaret about her life before Spokane. She'd been expecting the question for years, had prepared for it, but it still caught her off guard. They were sitting on the porch of their house, which Colt had expanded twice more to accommodate their growing family, watching Catherine and Henry play in the yard. Margaret took a breath and told James a simplified version of the truth about losing her parents young, about working hard and facing difficulties, about coming west to find a better life. "So Sullivan wasn't your real last name?" James asked, his young face serious. "No, I chose it when I came here because I wanted a fresh start. But then I married your father and became Margaret Vaughn, and that's who I've been ever since." "What was your name before?" "Florence Brennan. That was the name my parents gave me." James considered this for a moment. "I like Margaret better. It suits you." Margaret laughed, surprised and delighted by his matter-of-fact acceptance. "I like it better too." That conversation opened the door to more honesty with her children. And over the next few years, Margaret gradually shared more of her history with them, age-appropriate details about her journey west and the reasons she'd left everything behind. She wanted them to understand that she'd made mistakes and faced hardships, but that those experiences had shaped her into the person she'd become. By the turn of the century, Spokane had grown from a rough frontier town into a thriving city of over 30,000 people. The Vaughn General Store had become Vaughn and Sons, with James working alongside his parents and showing real aptitude for the family business. Catherine had announced her intention to become a teacher, much to Margaret's pride, and Henry was still young enough that his future was unwritten. Colt and Margaret were in their early 40s now, no longer the young couple who'd fallen in love over bolts of fabric and shared lunches. But their love had deepened with time, growing roots that ran as deep as the mountains surrounding their city. They still worked together, still came home together, still found joy in each other's company after nearly 2 decades of marriage. On a spring evening in 1901, they took a walk through Spokane's downtown, marveling at electric lights and paved streets and all the markers of progress and civilization. They passed the spot where the original general store had stood before they'd moved to a larger location, and Margaret paused, remembering the frightened woman who'd walked these same streets 19 years earlier. "What are you thinking about?" Colt asked, taking her hand. "About that first day when I got off the stagecoach," Margaret said. "How scared I was, how lost I felt, how certain I was that I'd never be able to stop running. And now I can't imagine being anywhere else. This is home. It always will be." Colt pulled her close, right there on the street where anyone could see, and kissed her with the kind of affection that comes from years of partnership and love. "You gave me everything when you decided to stay," he said. "Everything that matters. You gave it back to me," Margaret replied. "When you said you didn't need my real name, that who I was in that moment was enough, you gave me permission to become someone new, someone better, someone who could finally stop running and start living." They walked home hand in hand as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Their children were waiting for them, their business was thriving, their life was full and rich and exactly what Margaret had been searching for without knowing it all those years ago. She changed her name twice before reaching Spokane, shedding identities like armor, protecting herself from a past that threatened to define her. But Colt had seen through the names to the person underneath, had loved her not despite her history, but because of everything she'd survived and become. He'd given her the greatest gift possible, the freedom to choose who she wanted to be, and she'd chosen this. Love, family, community, home. She'd chosen Margaret and Margaret had chosen him, and together they'd built something that would outlast them both. As they reached their house, the lights warm and welcoming in the gathering dusk, their children's voices drifting out into the evening air, Margaret felt a profound sense of gratitude for every choice she'd made, every name she'd used, every mile she'd traveled. Because all of it, the fear and the courage and the desperate hope, had led her here, to Spokane, to Colt, to home, and she would never run again. In 1904, James married a local girl named Sarah Thompson, and Margaret watched her firstborn son exchange vows with tears in her eyes. She remembered her own wedding day 21 years earlier, remembered the joy and relief and overwhelming sense of rightness. She hoped James felt the same, hoped he understood how lucky he was to have found someone to build a life with. Catherine graduated from the teaching college in 1906 and took a position at Spokane's new elementary school, teaching first grade with the same patient determination she'd shown as a child. Henry, at 15, was still deciding his future, torn between following his siblings into their respective paths or forging something entirely his own. Colt's hair had gone gray at the temples, and Margaret found she liked the distinguished look it gave him. Her own hair showed threads of silver too, and there were lines around her eyes and mouth that spoke of years spent smiling and squinting into the sun. They were middle-aged now, no longer young but not yet old, settled into the comfortable rhythms of a long marriage. The business continued to thrive. though they'd begun the gradual process of transitioning control to James, preparing him to eventually take over completely. Margaret found she didn't mind stepping back, that after more than 2 decades of building and managing and planning, she was ready to focus on other things. She'd started doing charity work, organizing relief efforts for families struggling through hard times, using her own experiences with poverty and displacement to guide her efforts. In 1908, James and Sarah made Margaret and Colt grandparents for the first time, a little girl they named Margaret Susan after both grandmothers. Holding her tiny namesake in her arms, Margaret felt the circle of life complete itself in a way that was both humbling and profound. This child would grow up knowing only stability and love, would never have to run or hide or question her place in the world. That felt like the greatest gift Margaret could give her, that security purchased with years of hard work and determination. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1908, the entire family gathered for a celebration at their home. Children and grandchildren, friends and business associates, neighbors who'd known them for decades. There were speeches and toasts, laughter and stories, and throughout it all, Margaret held Colt's hand and marveled at the life they'd built together. 25 years, Colt said when they finally had a moment alone, standing together on their porch watching the party continue inside. A quarter-century of marriage. How did we get so lucky? It wasn't luck, Margaret said, looking up at him with eyes that still held all the love she'd felt that first day in the general store. It was choice. You chose to see me, really see me, when I was hiding behind false names and manufactured stories. You chose to love me even when I couldn't promise I'd stay. And I chose to trust you to believe that maybe, finally, I could stop running. We chose each other, Colt. That's not luck. That's love. He kissed her then, gentle and sweet, the kind of kiss that spoke of years together and years still to come. And Margaret knew with absolute certainty that she'd made the right choice that day in 1882 when she'd stepped off the stagecoach in Spokane. She'd found home, found love, found herself in a rough frontier town that had grown into a city without losing its essential character. She'd changed her name twice before reaching his town, shedding identities in a desperate attempt to escape her past. But the cowboy, her cowboy, had said he didn't need the real one, and in giving her that freedom, he'd helped her discover who she really was beneath all the names and all the fear. She was Margaret Vaughn. She was loved. She was home, and that was more than enough. Years continued to unfold with the steady grace of a life well lived. Henry eventually decided to pursue medicine, leaving Spokane to attend medical school in Seattle before returning to open a practice in his hometown. Catherine married a fellow teacher in 1910, and they started a family of their own. James and Sarah had 3 more children, filling Margaret and Colt's golden years with the chaos and joy of grandchildren. The Vaughn General Store, now truly Vaughn and Sons with James fully in charge, continued to be a cornerstone of Spokane's commercial district. Margaret and Colt still stopped by regularly, offering advice when asked, but mostly just enjoying watching the next generation take the reins. In 1915, on a clear autumn day that reminded Margaret of that first day she'd arrived in Spokane, 33 years earlier, she and Colt took a trip to the cemetery to visit Samuel's grave. They did this a few times a year, tidying the plot and leaving flowers, talking to him about the business and the family and everything he was missing. "I think he'd be proud," Colt said, standing with his arm around Margaret's waist. "Of what we built, how the children turned out, all of it." "I know he would be," Margaret agreed. "He was a good man, your father. He accepted me without question, trusted me when he had no reason to. I never properly thanked him for that. He knew. He told me once near the end that you were the best thing that ever happened to me. That watching you grow from that scared girl into a confident woman, into my wife and the mother of his grandchildren, was one of the greatest joys of his later years. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, moved by this glimpse into Samuel's thoughts. I wish I'd known him longer. You knew him long enough to make a difference, and he's still here in a way. In James's business sense, in Catherine's stubborn integrity, in Henry's compassion. He lives on through all of us. They stood together in the quiet cemetery, the city sprawling below them, and Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her here. All the fear and running, all the false names and desperate choices, they'd led to this. To love, to family, to a legacy that would outlast them both. She was 61 years old now, and Colt was 64, and they were growing old together with the kind of grace that comes from a lifetime of partnership. Her hands were marked with age spots, and her hair had gone fully gray, and she'd never felt more beautiful than when Colt looked at her with the same love and desire he'd shown 33 years ago. In 1920, they celebrated their 37th wedding anniversary with their children and grandchildren, now numbering 15 in total. The house was full of noise and life. 3 generations of Vaughns gathered under one roof, and Margaret felt such profound satisfaction she almost couldn't contain it. This was what she'd been running toward all along, though she hadn't known it at the time. Not just survival, not just safety, but this. Connection, community, love that multiplied and expanded and continued beyond her own life. She'd started with nothing but fear and determination, and she'd built an empire of family and belonging. Late that night, after everyone had gone home and they were getting ready for bed, Colt pulled Margaret into his arms and held her close. "I love you," he said, the words as meaningful as they'd been the first time he'd spoken them. "I love you more today than I did yesterday, and I'll love you more tomorrow than I do today. You're everything, Margaret, everything that matters." "I love you too," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved me, Colt. When I was broken and scared and didn't know who I was anymore, you saw something worth saving. You gave me a life worth living." "You saved yourself," Colt corrected gently. "You had the courage to stop running, to trust me, to build something real. I just gave you a reason to stay." They climbed into bed together, fitting against each other with the ease of long practice, and Margaret thought about all the beds she'd slept in during those years of running. Hotel rooms and boarding houses, each one temporary, each one another place she'd have to leave eventually. But this bed in this house with this man was home. Permanent and real and hers. She fell asleep in Colt's arms as she had for nearly 4 decades, safe and loved and exactly where she belonged. Margaret Vaughn lived another 12 years, surrounded by family and love until the end. When she died in 1932 at the age of 70, she was mourned by the entire city of Spokane, remembered as a pillar of the community, a successful businesswoman, and a devoted wife and mother. Her obituary mentioned that she'd come from Philadelphia originally, but it didn't mention Victoria Harrison or Elizabeth Marsh or any of the other names she'd used along the way. She was Margaret Vaughn, and that was the only name that mattered. Colt followed her 5 years later, his heart finally giving out at the age of 81. They were buried side by side in the cemetery overlooking the city they'd helped build, and their children made sure the headstone read, "Margaret Brennan, Vaughn 1860–1932, beloved wife, mother, grandmother she found home Colt Vaughn 1856–1937, beloved husband, father, grandfather he showed her the way their story became part of Spokane's history, passed down through generations of Vaughns and into the collective memory of the city itself." The story of a woman who'd changed her name twice before reaching town, and the cowboy who'd said he didn't need the real one. It became a legend of love and acceptance, of choosing to see the person beneath the protective layers, of building something lasting from the most fragile beginnings. And in every telling, the ending was always the same. She stopped running. He gave her a reason to stay. And together they built a life that mattered, a love that lasted, a legacy that endured long after they were gone. It was, in every way that counted, a perfect love story. Not because it was easy or without challenge, but because they chose each other every day. Because when Margaret had been at her most vulnerable, using borrowed names to protect herself from a world that had hurt her, Colt had looked past the deception to see the truth underneath. He hadn't needed her real name because he'd understood something fundamental. Identity isn't just what we're born with, it's what we choose to become. Margaret had chosen to become someone brave enough to stop running, someone strong enough to trust again, someone worthy of love and home and happiness. And Colt had chosen to love her, not despite her complicated past, but because of everything she'd survived and overcome. Their children and grandchildren carried forward that lesson, understanding that love means accepting someone completely, history and all. The Vaughn family continued to thrive in Spokane, generation after generation, always remembering the story of how it all began with a frightened woman and a patient man, and a simple statement that changed everything. I don't need the real one. 4 words that gave Margaret permission to be herself, to choose her own identity, to stop hiding and start living. 4 words that contained more love and acceptance than 1,000 grand gestures. The store that bore their name continued operating into the 21st century, eventually becoming a local landmark, a reminder of Spokane's frontier past and the people who'd built it into a modern city. And every new generation of owners heard the story of Margaret and Colt, of how their great-great-grandparents had fallen in love over bolts of fabric and shared lunches, how they'd built an empire from nothing but hard work and trust and unwavering commitment to each other. It was a story worth remembering, worth telling, worth carrying forward into the future. Because at its heart, it wasn't about names or running or frontier towns. It was about finding home in another person, about the courage it takes to stop hiding, about love that sees past the surface to the truth underneath. Margaret changed her name twice before reaching Spokane, but when she finally stopped running, she discovered something she'd been searching for all along, a place where she could just be herself, whatever name she chose to use. And Colt gave her that gift with his simple acceptance, his willingness to love the woman she was rather than demanding she be someone else. Together, they proved that home isn't a place or a name. It's a choice, made new each day to stay and build and love and trust. It's the courage to be vulnerable, the strength to be honest, the wisdom to accept people as they are rather than as you wish they'd be. And that, in the end, is the greatest love story of all.